I clearly am not trusted in this matter. So, also, Joe Mulholland said when he was asking me to talk about this, he said, "Don't give us too much of that old history stuff." So, MacGill has joined the History is Bunk Brigade, I think. Anyway, just to move on, Stephen's talk there was a very good outline of a background against which I want to make some very simple remarks and propose one or two things that could be done to help the system deliver government at a time when parliamentarians are governing immensely complex realities, because we have a global society, a global economy. Internationalism is just everywhere. And if TDs are going to really do that job and manage that system and not just be ciphers, they're going to have to go about it somewhat differently than our traditional model has been, because the whole world of decision making and reality has changed dramatically. So I'm going to talk not therefore about how our Parliament works. Stephen and all of his colleagues, we do have a huge debate going on about that, both Dáil and Shannon. I'm going to concentrate on two aspects of the political system, how problems can be perceived in them, and perhaps how we might go about making the situation a bit better in practical reality. And I'm going to talk about the way we elect our parliamentarians, and I'm going to just talk about Dáil Éireann on this occasion. The Shannon can be a debate. It's part of our parliamentary system, but I'm talking about the Dáil, and I also want to talk a bit about the role of our local authorities and the use we make of those. So we use in Ireland the single transferable voting system, combined with multi-seat constituencies. That is the system we have. We got that in 1921, just before our state was founded. And when it was being put into place then, very much in mind was the Unionist and Protestant populations in what became the Republic of Ireland. So that to ensure that they would have representation in the new system. And in outcomes, it is generally regarded as doing that, doing what it says on the tin, ensuring reasonable, if not fully proportional representation, and including minorities, smaller parties, minority groups in the representational mix. It's an old system. It's in many ways arcane. Sometimes you find it in other countries in bits and pieces, part of their local system and so on. For national parliamentary elections, it's only used in two countries that I know of, one of them being Ireland, of course, the other being Malta. It's regarded as being difficult, it's highly criticised generally. People don't use it pretty well anywhere else in such a broad-scale way. It has been criticised in two ways generally. And it's why people don't use it. It's complex and awkward type of system, people think. It produces it gives a good representation, consequently has a reputation for giving unstable outcomes. So that if you want strong government capable of making decisions, you don't go onto this kind of a system. And then it has also been criticised, a different type of criticism, for embedding clientelism in politics. A politician in this system, the multi-seat plus STV, is in many ways an advocate, she's a councillor, she's a social worker, she's whatever you have yourself. In other words, they are all-purpose people serving their constituents. And so just to take those two criticisms, first of all, and bear in mind, you can't judge a system by the results of one election. Obviously, the last election gave us a very much a licorice all sorts type of a result. But just park that. In any historical sense, you would just treat that as one example. We had a similar one in 1948, and out of that, the system resolved its difficulties and so on. So it might do the same on this occasion. We've had the system for 95 years, generally well liked by Irish voters. It's criticised to be complicated than that, but our electorate understands it. And people like voting through the paper. You know, I'm talking about in order of your choice, 1 to as far as you want to go, right down to the bottom. It works. The message at the door might be to the prospective candidate, well, my number 1 is promised, but I'd consider giving you a 2 or 3, maybe. It's a kind of a democratic papal blessing given to the candidates before they're sent off into the rainy night to go to the next door. But they've a promise, sure, I'll give you a stroke. But they're never sure what that stroke is going to be or where it'll be in the paper. Our counting system has been criticised being burdensome and long-winded. It's all of that. But the Irish electorate understands it, not only accepts it, but are actually very fond of it. We found that when our attempt to go to electronic counting was thrown aside. We felt it was very unkind to the losing candidates. They got all the bad news in one big go. They didn't have 12 or 24 hours to anaesthetise themselves for the bad news later on. And then the thrills and spills of the count, you know, the near-death experiences, people are gone, and then they're back. And sometimes in the end, Lazarus goes from white to purple in the face and is raised high on shoulders in adulation. One recalls a count in Castlebar in 2002 when Jim Higgins looked very good and a certain Henry Kenny was preparing his valedictory remarks. And it all changed around with the elimination of one local Fianna Fáil candidate who changed the order of preference between those two gentlemen, and you all know the results from that. On the question of giving instability, that just does not stand up on Ireland. Since for the 95 years we've had it, our first government, Common and Gael government, was won 3 elections, and it gave the country a very unstable country, stable government for 10 years. It was able to change to another government which lasted for 16 years, saw the country through the economic war and the economic war with Britain and the First World War, and the Second World War, and the Second World War, of course, and all of that desperately hard time. And thereon, if anything, this country had huge stability, with long periods of Fianna Fáil government interspersed with periods of coalition governments. In more recent times, the norm became coalition governments. But on average, our governments lasted approximately 4 years. And in democratic terms, that's a very solid, stable length of time. So we've had great stability. Now, you might say the real argument here, if you're fans of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, you would say that the people needed summer holidays. That was a drug they used to use in those times to give themselves some relief from the prevailing stability of the system. We had far too much stability in this country would be a criticism rather than the opposite. And the fact that we have an unstable system now, in that sense, doesn't change that reality at all. I'd refer then to the second criticism of the PR multi-seat constituency model, and that is the clientelism one. Promotes clientelism in politics. And I think that would always be said to be detrimental to parliamentarians doing their real duty, which is to do legislation, govern the country, develop wise policies and all of that really good stuff, and make sure everything is implemented. Instead, PRSTV for a TD is a bit like the Smyrna ad. It leaves them continually breathless. They're always looking and watching their backs, not only from the other parties against them, but also the electoral enemy within their own ranks, the way we do it. All of a politician's greatest threats nearly always come from within their own party. The golfer Lee Trevino characterised 2 forms of life that don't last long. One, he said, dogs that chase cars. Secondly, golfers. Some of you will get this one. Golfers who sink putts from 20 feet to save par. And then we can add a third category, TDs who don't nurture their constituencies, hold regular clinics and knock on doors. And of course, bury the dead, and more crucially, be seen to do so. These are undeniable facts that TDs who don't have a regular presence in their constituencies, who are not available to voters and do not respond to requests, they're unlikely to be elected for very long. They'll be like the dog that chases the cars. Or at best, they have great difficulty in the matter. So if it's a choice between looking after your constituency's needs, being present for them, taking care of them and all of their issues, under our current system, if the choice is being that and being continually in Dublin. I don't know how I've often heard the complaint about a TD. Sure, he's very brainy, but he's always up in Dublin. And they're easily taken out by people at the local level. So we have to have a look at that problem. And the fact that social media is so ubiquitous now, your Facebook, your Twitter, your Instagram, texting, email communications. I thought at one stage this would change that reality because you can have that connectivity. It doesn't matter. People are not interested in likes, and to use the language of that world. What the Irish electorate wants from their TDs is a bit of love, presence at the door, meeting them regularly, being in the clinic where they can be found, lights on, somebody home. And I think if we combine that reality with the world very eloquently and persuasively outlined by Stephen, and see how do we make the match, I think we have to look at the way we elect our politicians if we are to give that new reality of governing and parliamentary action a chance of surviving. So I am making the assumption in all of this that reducing clientelism is a good thing, that enabling TDs as legislators is a good thing. And I would say that our recent history, where through the terrible tragedy as a nation we've gone through in 10 years, the failure of our political system to at any stage grasp it, either in the 5 years in which it was building, coming at us, even to see it coming. There was a total failure. And we talk about that failure being in the banks and being in the regulators' places and so on. But it was also in the political world. The politicians didn't see it coming. And I make that as a general comment. And maybe the odd exception said they did. But if they did, their voices weren't heard at the time. So what I would say, we must look at our system and see can we create a different environment for our political system to work within. We haven't really tried any change since 1921. De Valera tried to bring in the single vote system. That was the fundamental thing he was trying to do. It was rejected by a referendum at the time. I'm not suggesting the single vote system be introduced here. What I would suggest is that we retain our single transferable vote, but that we combine it with single seat constituencies. That would be the significant change I think that would help. It would be a radical move for a country that has never experimented with new election models. But it's not as dramatic as anyone might think. It would, in effect, replicate the experience of parliamentary by-elections. Parliamentary by-elections are a single transferable vote in a single-seat constituency. So you just have a lot more constituencies and smaller ones, and you run it in that way. Each party would nominate just one candidate for each constituency, just removing that element of rivalry within the party once the election is on. It would make getting elected and re-elected a bit more manageable, I think, for the sitting TDs. And at the same time, the SDV aspect would guarantee a good element of representation. The fact that the overall system would, at a minimum, not damage the prospect of sitting TDs means that there would be some chance this reform might be accepted. Because any reform in the system has to be first accepted by the existing generation of parliamentarians. And after that, then it goes to the people for a referendum because it's a constitutional matter. So if you don't get acceptance for the parliamentarians, you're not going anywhere with your ideas. I think this will be well worthy of their consideration. I think we could also involve elements of the dominant European model, which is the list system, We could bring elements of this in here, a bit as they do in the Scottish elections. You wouldn't say you had your 158 seats, you wouldn't have 158 constituencies, you could have less. You could have, say, 130 constituencies and elect 130 deputies that way and distribute the other 28 seats through a list. And the list would go to develop the representational nature of the results. So, if your party got 10% of the vote and you're only 7% of the seat, the list would be used to bring you up to as close as you can get to proportional representation. So I think there's a very good possibility there of getting a very, very effective system which would have quite a different effect than the current one. Phil Hogan tried this in Fine Gael before the 2011 election, when we were doing policy, to bring in, I think he was saying 20 seats as a list. However, it got shot down in flames internally. The argument used against it was, well, all the smarties would be on the smart, high-achieving citizens would be on the list. You know, they'd be great academics, they'd be great business people, whatever. And they would end up getting all the good jobs in government, whereas the poor deputies who did all the hard work and won all the votes. So that was an argument against it. You'd have to think about arguments like that because they're very practical and very human. Now, however, you have to do something else then if you want to get reduced clientelism, as well as doing what I'm saying. The next thing you need to do is to look to the needs of voters. Irish voters do not trust bureaucracy, national or local. They do not think they respond actively to their needs. They have much greater faith in the political system to be their friend and to be at their side. So they need local office representation where they can go with their problems. So side by side with the change of the way we elect our deputies, we need to develop a system of significant devolution of power to the local government system. Every county and city has substantial local government capacity. They have offices, they have managers, they have highly skilled staff. And every county has a population of elected city and county councillors. The apparatus is there and capable of doing much more than it does. In Ireland, we've had an inexorable trend, particularly since 1977, towards centralisation of power and function at national level and denuding the functionality of the local authority system. Now, that could be and should be substantially reversed. More power and function can be devolved to local authorities with larger budgets, power to raise funds independently, and to choose the methodology of how those funds are raised. In other words, creating real politics at local level. And the status of the councillors needs to be raised. They have been, in an incredible way, a total second-class citizen in the Irish political system. Councillors should be paid realistic salaries and have the resources allocated to establish and maintain local offices. And all public queries and requests for assistance could go through this council network, which would liaise with the TDs in the rare enough occasion where a national involvement is required. This frees up the TD to concentrate on being an effective legislator at the national and international level and allows local representatives the space and power to fulfil their own mandates. The TD would still have competition, but in this context it would be a manageable composition and all of the other TDs effectively be working by the same rules. And by changing the electoral system in this way and by empowering local government, it will be possible to have a significant impact on how the government is delivered to the people. TDs could become dedicated, informed and skilled legislators without putting their political career at permanent and unreasonable risk. Their outlook would be to participate in and deliver government. Hopefully we wouldn't have a category where maybe 40% of the TDs elected by definition exclude themselves from government because their concept of parliamentary involvement is oppositional, contrarian type of activity rather than the delivery of government, the taking of decisions and to doing what's in the best interest of the country. Political assistance and advocacy could be delivered to the general population by dedicated skilled local politicians, networking closely and efficiently with the empowered local authority administrations, which would become much more effective instruments of delivery of government within regions. Now, after 95 years of independent living in Ireland, instead of continually complaining about clientelism, in this way I think we could move to do something about it. It's not an overnight thing, and a lot of thought would need to go into it. Issues would arise concerning, for instance, the number of TDs you would require, ideally, in this system, the number of councillors and councils you need. But all of these are decisions for another day. I would say there is a fundamental problem at the heart of the way we do our politics, which comes from the way we set it up in 1921. The world has changed so utterly since then. We have never looked at this. And an awful lot of the problems we continually agonise about come from the root of the way we put everybody in place. So that would be my modest proposal for this morning or this afternoon.